Elaine Summers stood frozen in the aisle, her Platinum Elite badge trembling in her grip as two uniformed officers stepped forward. "You can't do this to me," she screamed, but no one moved, no one spoke, not even the teen she had tried to humiliate. At 35,000 feet, silence had finally answered arrogance, and dignity had won without ever raising its voice. The cabin of Skylux Airways Flight 882 buzzed with the quiet hum of pre-departure routines, flight attendants organizing last-minute service carts, passengers adjusting carry-ons, overhead bins being snapped shut. In seats 2A and 2B, two young black teens sat side by side, their expressions a mixture of excitement and measured calm. Avery Brooks leaned back slowly into the plush cream leather, trying to hide the grin tugging at the corners of his mouth. His twin sister, Jordan, smoothed the collar of her button-down blouse and glanced toward the window, her eyes reflecting the gentle orange hue of the late afternoon sun. At 16, this was their first trip without their father, no private driver, no assistants, just the two of them, flying first class from New York to Seattle for a summer youth tech summit. The seats had been a gift, a quiet nod of trust from their father, Derek Brooks, the high-profile CEO of one of America's fastest-growing renewable energy firms. Derek believed in preparing his children not just with knowledge, but with the lived experience of walking confidently through spaces that weren't always welcoming. Avery and Jordan understood that more than most kids their age. "You think Dad's tracking the flight already?" Jordan asked, a hint of nerves tucked behind her usual cool tone. Avery chuckled and tapped the screen in front of him. "You know he's got the gate number memorized and probably the pilot's name, too." Jordan smiled, then went back to reading the printed itinerary Derek had handed them that morning, highlighting key check-in times and instructions in blue pen. "He really wanted this to be perfect," she said quietly. "It already is," Avery replied. But that was before the air around them shifted. It began with the sound of deliberate, impatient footsteps and heels, clicking sharply down the aisle. A tall white woman in her early 50s stopped directly in front of their row. Her fitted cream coat and oversized designer tote made her presence unmistakable. Her name, as they would soon hear repeated far too often, was Elaine Summers. And from the moment her eyes landed on the two teenagers, the atmosphere inside the first-class cabin began to constrict like a room losing air. "This must be a mistake," she said aloud, her voice laced with disbelief. Her tone wasn't addressed to anyone in particular, but loud enough for half the cabin to hear. She turned to the nearest flight attendant, gesturing with a pointed red manicured finger. "Excuse me, seats 2A and 2B, those are mine. I always sit there." The attendant, a young man named Tom, glanced nervously at his tablet. "I'm sorry, Miss Summers, but those seats are currently assigned to the Brooks passengers." Elaine's lips tightened into a practiced, tight-lipped smile, the kind that held no warmth. She took a deep breath and turned to face Avery and Jordan. "I don't think you understand," she said with clipped precision. "These are my seats. I've flown in them every Tuesday and Friday for 7 years. Platinum Elite. That's not just a label, it's earned." Avery blinked, unsure if he was meant to respond. Jordan leaned forward slightly, her voice calm but firm. "Our father booked these seats for us 2 weeks ago. We have our boarding passes." Elaine tilted her head, then gave a theatrical laugh that drew glances from across the aisle. "Oh, sweetie, I'm sure you think that's true. But people like me, loyal customers, we don't just get moved to the side." She turned again to the flight attendant. "Move them to the back. There are always a few empty rows in business." The flight attendant hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "I'm afraid I can't do that, ma'am." The seats were legally purchased and confirmed. Elaine scoffed loudly. "Don't recite policy to me. This is first class, not a student tour group. These kids shouldn't even be here." Her words cut through the cabin, and for the first time, Jordan's composure wavered. She reached for the armrest. Avery placed a hand gently over hers. He knew that silence, held properly, could be louder than any retort. That's what their father always said. But the damage had been done. Whispers floated through the rows. Eyes watched from behind newspapers and tablet screens. Yet no one spoke up. No one intervened. Then, as if insult had not yet reached its peak, the flight supervisor approached. Marla Jennings, blonde and brisk, with a clipboard tucked beneath one arm. "Is there a problem here?" she asked, eyeing the teens before turning to Elaine. Elaine launched into her practiced speech. "Yes. I'm being asked to sit somewhere else while children who don't even look old enough to drive are being allowed to take my seat. I'm Platinum Elite. You know what that means." Marla nodded slowly, then turned to the twins. "Would you two be willing to move just a few rows back? I understand these seats were reserved, but this passenger is a long-time customer, and we're trying to avoid any delays." Jordan's eyes widened. "But these are our seats," she said, stunned. "We're not the ones causing a delay." Avery leaned closer to Marla, lowering his voice. "We have our confirmation emails. Our dad booked this through the corporate concierge. This isn't a mistake." Marla looked tired. "I understand. But sometimes, a little flexibility helps keep things smooth. You'd still be in first class. Just not here." Avery stared at her. The implication was clear. Let the privilege win. Keep quiet, give ground, and avoid trouble. But not today. Not after what their father had taught them. Without a word, Avery stood up, gesturing for Jordan to follow. They walked past Elaine, who smirked as they passed, and slipped quietly behind the curtain separating first class from the galley. The silence between them was thick with frustration, but not defeat. Inside the galley, Avery pulled out his phone and turned his back to the cabin. Jordan didn't have to ask who he was calling. There was only one number you called when the world decided to pretend your rights were negotiable. Derek Brooks answered on the second ring. Derek Brooks answered on the second ring. His voice came through calm, low, and steady, like the rumble of distant thunder before the storm breaks. "Avery. Talk to me." The software of the plane's ventilation system hummed around them as Avery pressed the phone to his ear, one hand shielding his voice, the other still resting protectively on his sister's arm. "We're on the flight, Dad. Everything was fine until she boarded. A woman named Elaine Summers. She says our seats are hers. She's Platinum Elite. She's shouting, making a scene. The flight supervisor tried to move us. Told us to be flexible so they can take off on time." There was a pause. A deep one. The kind of silence that told you not a single detail had slipped past him. Then Derek spoke. "You're still on the plane?" "Yes," Avery confirmed, his voice clipped with restrained anger. "They haven't taken off. We're still at the gate." "Good," Derek replied. "Stay calm. Stay where you are. I'll handle this." The line clicked off. That was all they needed to hear. Jordan exhaled slowly, the knot in her chest loosening just slightly. They returned to their seats in 2A and 2B, passing Elaine in the aisle. She was still standing, arms crossed, lips curled into a self-satisfied smirk like she had won something. But she didn't know who Derek Brooks was. Not yet. 12 floors above Manhattan, in the glass-paneled executive suite of Solaritech, Derek Brooks stood from his desk, eyes hard, voice sharper than the 1,000 solar panels his company had installed across the country. "Get me Michael Tran at Skylux," he said to his assistant without breaking stride. Within 2 minutes, the line was patched through to the office of Skylux CEO Michael Tran, a man known more for strategic expansion than public scandal, but today, he was about to face a crisis unlike any other. "Derek," Michael greeted, though his tone immediately turned cautious. "Everything all right?" "Not even close," Derek answered. "My children, Avery and Jordan, are sitting on Flight 882, seats 2A and 2B, first class. Tickets confirmed, paid, documented. But right now, a passenger named Elaine Summers is trying to have them removed, claiming seniority, platinum status, whatever excuse she thinks will work. Your staff isn't protecting them. They're pressuring them to move. And they're only 16. Michael didn't interrupt. He knew better. Derek, I'll handle it personally. Stay on the line. In the Operations Control Center of JFK, alarms don't flash red for injustice, but Michael Tran made sure this time it would. Within 10 minutes, 2 Skylux senior executives boarded Flight 882 just as the cabin door was preparing to close. Clyde Harrison, Vice President of Customer Relations, wore a trim navy suit and an expression of practiced calm. Behind him walked Rachel Lynn, head of passenger rights, sharp-eyed, tablet in hand. The tension in the cabin was thick enough to slice through. All eyes turned as the men in suits approached the front. Clyde didn't waste time. "We're looking for passengers Avery and Jordan Brooks," he said clearly. The twins raised their hands from their seats. Elaine let out a breathy scoff. "Of course they are," she muttered, already bracing herself for a victory she was sure was coming. Clyde turned to her. "And you are?" "Elaine Summers. Platinum Elite." "These are my seats," she declared, gesturing like a judge pointing out defendants. Rachel was already scrolling through her tablet. "Miss Summers, according to our flight records, the seats in 2A and 2B were reserved under the names Avery and Jordan Brooks, confirmed and paid through corporate account code SOL 92613. She turned the screen for all to see. "Booked 2 weeks ago." Elaine's expression barely flickered. "I don't care what the system says. I've sat there for years. There's an understanding. This is how loyalty should work." Clyde's voice was cool steel. "Miss Summers, loyalty does not override legality. It does not override policy. And it certainly does not override basic decency." Elaine's nostrils flared. "So that's it? We're letting children toss aside long-standing customers like garbage?" Clyde didn't respond to the bait. Instead, he turned to Marla, the flight supervisor. "Why weren't these passengers protected?" Marla's voice cracked slightly. "I was trying to keep the flight on time. We thought it would be easier to pressure minors to give up confirmed seats rather than confront an aggressive adult." Rachel's voice cut in, quiet but lethal. "That's not protocol. That's failure." Marla looked stunned. The flight attendant, Tom Reyes, hovered behind her, trying to become invisible. Clyde turned to him. "Did you inform the passengers of their rights? Did you intervene?" "I followed Marla's lead," Tom mumbled. Clyde nodded once. Then he stepped aside. From the cockpit, Captain Alan Ross emerged, tall and imposing in his Navy uniform. "Captain Ross," Clyde said, "can you address what happens next if passenger behavior continues to interfere with the operation of this flight?" Captain Ross didn't blink. His voice was clear. "Any passenger, regardless of membership status, who endangers the safety, comfort, or rights of others on board will be removed from the aircraft at my discretion. Permanently." Elaine tried to laugh. "You're joking." But Captain Ross didn't laugh. "I'm not." Elaine looked around for support. None came. A businessman in 3C folded his newspaper a little louder. A young woman near the aisle put in her earbuds. Elaine's moment was over. But her mouth hadn't caught up. "You think you can treat me like this?" she spat, voice rising. "I will sue this airline. I will drag your names through every forum I can find. I know people." Clyde turned slowly. "And yet, you don't seem to know what dignity looks like." He stepped aside. "Security, please." 2 uniformed airport officers entered the cabin. No shouting. No handcuffs. Just quiet. Efficiency and the weight of protocol. Elaine shrieked, but it was shrill and empty, like a balloon deflating in public. She was escorted off the plane, still grasping the lanyard of her Platinum Elite badge like it could change what had just happened. As the cabin door closed behind her, the hum of the engine seemed louder, freer. Clyde turned to Marla and Tom. "You are suspended, effective immediately, pending internal review for professional misconduct and failure to uphold company policy." Marla's face drained of color. Tom simply nodded. The new flight crew would be briefed mid-air. But the damage was done, and so was the reckoning. Clyde turned to the Brooks twins. Avery. Jordan. On behalf of Skylux Airways, I am deeply sorry. Avery didn't gloat. Jordan didn't smile. They simply nodded with quiet composure. Dignity, their father always said, isn't about what you wear or where you sit. It's how you hold your ground when someone tries to take it. And today, they had held firm. The plane began to taxi toward the runway. The cabin was quiet, not because it had been silenced, but because, for the first time, everyone knew what had just happened mattered. Justice had boarded Flight 882. And it was flying at 30,000 feet. As Flight 882 taxied down the runway beneath the fading light of a Manhattan afternoon, the quiet inside the first-class cabin felt less like the hush after a disruption and more like the stillness after a storm, the kind that leaves you looking around, breathing deeper, knowing something has changed. Avery and Jordan Brooks sat once again in seats 2A and 2B, not in triumph, not in bitterness, but in the calm that only comes after standing your ground and watching the world shift around you. The hum of the engines grew steadier, more focused, as if echoing their own clarity. Across the aisle, a few passengers glanced their way, no longer with hesitation or doubt, but with quiet recognition. Not applause. Just acknowledgement. And that, in its own way, meant more. 20 minutes into the flight, the overhead lights softened to a low amber, casting a warm glow across the cabin. From the front, a tall, composed man in a dark suit stepped forward. His badge read Samuel Grant, Regional Director, Skylux Airways. He paused briefly by the galley, then approached the Brooks twins with a demeanor that was not rehearsed, not performative, but sincere. Avery. Jordan, he began, bending slightly to meet them eye to eye. I want to speak not as an executive, but as someone who understands what it means to have to stay calm when everything in you wants to do the opposite. What you endured today was unacceptable. On behalf of Skylux, I want to offer our apology, publicly and personally. Jordan looked at him, her expression steady but not cold. We appreciate that, Mr. Grant. But this isn't just about us. It's about how easily people in uniform stayed silent when they should have spoken up. Samuel nodded slowly, his face drawn not with defensiveness but with understanding. You're absolutely right. And that's why this moment won't end at 30,000 feet. He handed Jordan a small folder, a written acknowledgement, formal and signed, with Skylux's new commitments outlined in full. Within 72 hours, he said, we will announce a new ethics protocol. It includes anti-discrimination training for every frontline employee. We're launching a passenger rights committee that operates independently of executive oversight. And we'll use this flight, this incident, as a case study in every single internal training session across the company. No exceptions. Avery glanced at the folder, then looked back at Samuel. I don't think people realize how much silence can hurt more than words, he said, his voice low. It wasn't just what Elaine said. It was how no one stopped her. How the crew looked at us like the problem was us. Samuel swallowed before answering. That silence was our failure. And it won't be repeated. You two reminded us of something we should have never forgotten. Dignity isn't a membership perk. It's a right. He stood up, gave them both a respectful nod, then turned back toward the galley, leaving the cabin filled with a soft echo of something that felt like accountability. From the cockpit, the captain's voice came over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Ross speaking. We're currently cruising at 35,000 feet and expect a smooth flight ahead. Thank you for your patience earlier, and for showing what respect can look like, even when things get difficult. The message was short, but it hung in the air like a quiet salute. Back in Manhattan, the screen inside Derek Brooks's office showed the flight icon gliding steadily across a digital map. A brief chime signaled the incoming message from the Skylux Operations Center. The report was crisp. Incident resolved. Passenger removed. Children seated in original seats. Formal apology delivered. Policy reform underway. Derek read every word twice, then leaned back in his chair, letting out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding since the call. His assistant, waiting nearby, asked softly, "Would you like me to cancel your next meeting?" Derek shook his head. "No. Just send a note to Skylux." He paused. "Tell them, I don't want special treatment for my kids. I just want them to be treated fairly, like any child should be." 3 days later, as headlines scrolled across news sites from coast to coast, the story had already taken on a life of its own. But not the usual viral firestorm. This wasn't a scandal fueled by outrage. It was a signal flare of accountability, of leadership, of two teenagers who didn't scream or fight but held still and let the truth do the speaking. The New York Times ran the headline, "Skylux Reforms After Teens Face Discrimination in First Class." The Washington Post published a guest op-ed titled "Privilege is Loud. Dignity is Quieter, but Stronger." In Seattle, a local station dubbed them the Brooks Twins who changed the skies. And in the Skylux headquarters media room, a prominently placed banner on the homepage read in bold, centered text, "We are listening. And we're changing." The announcement detailed the company's swift reforms. Every flight attendant, supervisor, and airport rep would complete a mandatory course in racial bias awareness and passenger rights. An independent passenger ethics review board was being formed. And most notably, the flight involving Avery and Jordan Brooks would be used internally to teach future crews how to act, not later, but the moment they see something wrong. Back at home in their quiet neighborhood in Westchester County, Avery and Jordan sat on the porch as the cicadas hummed in the trees. A soft summer wind rustled the branches above as the sun dipped behind the rooftops. They didn't talk about the articles, or the trending hashtags, or the dozens of interview requests their father had declined. Instead, they just let the silence stretch, peaceful now, not heavy. "Do you think it made a difference?" Jordan asked, watching the sky turn from orange to purple. Avery thought for a moment, then nodded slowly. "It didn't fix everything. But maybe the next time someone like Elaine starts acting entitled, the crew won't stay silent." Jordan smiled faintly. "Maybe the next kid sitting in seat 2A won't have to prove they belong there." A quiet pause followed. Then she added, "I used to think dignity meant being strong in public. But maybe it also means not letting someone else's ignorance make you smaller." Avery turned to her, his voice soft. "Dad always said it's not the applause that matters. It's what you stand for when no one's clapping." Inside, the news kept playing. But outside, beneath the stars just beginning to peek through the twilight, the only thing that mattered was the stillness, the peace that came not from winning, but from being seen, heard, and respected. And in that stillness, one truth remained as clear as the night sky stretching over their heads: dignity doesn't need applause. It just needs to stand its ground. What happened to Avery and Jordan Brooks on Flight 882 is, unfortunately, not an isolated story. It is a reflection of the quiet, everyday battles many people face when others believe status or tradition grants them superiority. What made this story different was how two young individuals, just 16 years old, chose not to argue, not to yell, not to retaliate, but to stand firm in truth. And that's the lesson we all need to carry: you don't need to shout to be strong. In a world that often rewards the loudest voice in the room, sometimes the greatest power is in calm defiance, in knowing your worth, and in trusting that justice begins with you. When you know you are right, when your dignity is not up for negotiation, you don't have to prove anything. You just need to remain grounded. Avery and Jordan didn't have the backing of a crowd. For most of that flight, they were alone, surrounded by silence and indifference. But they had each other. They had their values. And most importantly, they had the clarity to recognize that surrendering their seat wasn't just about geography, it was about surrendering a principle. To anyone listening who's ever been overlooked, underestimated, or told they don't belong, you do. Whether it's in a boardroom, a classroom, a courtroom, or a first-class cabin, your presence matters. You don't owe anyone an apology for taking up space you've earned. But what you do owe yourself is the courage to stay calm, the wisdom to speak with purpose, and the faith that the truth, when held steady, can move even the most rigid systems. Skylux's policy reforms, their public apology, and the national conversation that followed, none of that would have happened if the twins had just given up their seats quietly. And none of it would have mattered if they had lost their peace in the process. This wasn't just about fighting back. It was about showing the world how to respond, with grace, clarity, and strength.